No more pain. My ribs are already broken, she whispered, her voice a splintered thread in the hot Wyoming air. The lonely rancher on the trail didn't yet know her name, but he could see the bruises blooming under her torn dress and the weight in her eyes that said she'd been running far too long. In a land where silence could be as dangerous as a gun, he decided then against the gossip of the whole West that she would not face her trouble alone. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has traveled. The heat of late afternoon clung to the Wyoming plains like a heavy quilt, the kind that pressed down and stole the air from your lungs. The sky was a hard, unbroken blue, the kind that offered no mercy. Elijah Carter's gelding plodded along the narrow trail toward home, each step kicking up a lazy ghost of dust that hung low in the sun's amber light. His mind was fixed on the fence posts he'd need to replace before dark, and how the water troughs would run low by week's end if the wind didn't turn east and bring rain. Life out here was measured in repairs and provisions, in the quiet arithmetic of survival, and Elijah preferred it that way, straightforward, without surprises. But then ahead on the trail, like a shadow, where no shadow should have been, he saw her. She was leaning against the bleached wood of a milepost, half hidden by the tall sagebrush that crowded the path. At first he thought she might be resting, but something about the stiffness in her frame kept his eyes on her. Her dress, a pale green, faded nearly to gray, was torn at the hem and clung to her knees with the dust of long miles. Her hands clutched her ribs as though she were holding herself together by sheer will. Her hair, dark as river silt, hung in uneven strands over her face. His horse slowed without being asked. The faint turn of her head at the sound of hooves was enough to show the wince it caused. Her eyes met his, not the open plea of someone asking for help, but the weary, guarded look of a soul who had been let down too many times to expect kindness again. No more pain, she whispered the words, barely carrying over the dry wind. My ribs are almost broken. Elijah was already swinging down from the saddle. She flinched at the sudden movement, but she didn't bolt. Up close he could see the bluish shadows of bruises beneath the fabric at her side and how shallow her breathing was. He didn't waste words. Words could crowd out truth if they came too soon. How far have you come? His voice was low, steady. She shook her head, eyes darting to the road behind him as though measuring the distance to some place she'd fled. I can walk, she murmured, but the tremor in her voice and the way her knees quivered told him otherwise. He reached for her arm, slowly giving her time to see the movement. Her muscles were taut, coiled like a trapped animal's. With the careful gentleness he'd learned from years of calming skittish colts, he guided her toward the horse. She didn't resist, but each step seemed to pull the breath from her lungs. He lifted her easily, setting her sideways in the saddle so she wouldn't have to twist her torso. Her fingers gripped the worn leather horn knuckles, pale. Then Elijah swung up behind her, his arms braced loosely, leaving her room to breathe. They rode in silence. The trail narrowed where the grass grew tall, brushing against their boots, and the air carried the faint scent of sage and sun-baked soil. Against his chest he could feel the faint tremor of her frame, not from cold but from some deep reservoir of pain she kept locked inside. It was near dusk when the ranch came into. At the porch, she hesitated as if stepping down might anchor her in a place she wasn't sure she could trust. Elijah slid to the ground first, then reached up for her. This time she let him help. Inside the cabin was dim, the walls stained gold by the light of a single oil lamp. The table still held the remains of his midday meal, a tin plate, a crust of bread, a half-full coffee pot. She stood in the middle of the room, eyes flicking to the narrow bed in the corner, then to the shelf lined with jars. Sit, he said, nodding to the chair by the table. She obeyed, lowering herself slowly, one hand never leaving her ribs. He poured water into a tin cup and set it in front of her. She drank in small, careful swallows, as if afraid too much at once might break her apart. From the cedar chest, he took out a clean shirt, faded but whole, and draped it over the chair. You'll need this until your dress can be mended. Her eyes flicked up at him, startled by the simple offering before dropping again. He moved to the stove, heating water. The fire cracked and popped, filling the small space with the resinous scent of burning pine. She said nothing, but he could feel her gaze on him, as though weighing what sort of man he might be. When the water was ready, he brought it to her along with a strip of clean cloth. The silence between them was not the heavy kind that chokes a room, but the tentative quiet of two people unaccustomed to sharing their air. He didn't ask her name. Names were something given when someone was ready to be known. Later, as the last rim of sunlight faded from the windows, he stepped onto the porch. The sky had deepened to a rich early night blue, a single star trembling above the ridge. Behind him, he heard the faint creak of her chair, the rustle of her moving to the table. Some things arrive in a man's life without warning, like storms that roll in from a clear horizon, or strangers who carry their pain in silence. Inside, she was safe for tonight. Tomorrow would be another trail to ride. The first light of morning slipped pale through the cabin's single window, casting long, crooked shadows across the plank floor. The air held the cool trace of night, the kind that still tasted faintly of dew if you breathed slow enough. Elijah stepped quietly from the porch, bucket in hand, and crossed the yard toward the barn. The chickens muttered in their coop, and the milk cow lowed softly at his approach. When he came back, the bucket sloshing full, she was at the table. She wore a shirt now, the sleeves rolled to her elbows, the hem nearly brushing her knees. Her hair was pulled into a loose knot, though a strand had fallen forward, curling against her cheek. In front of her sat the loaf of bread from yesterday, a knife in her hand. She was slicing it with care, but her movements were deliberate, slow, as if each pull of the blade took more effort than it should. "You shouldn't strain," he said, setting the bucket down. "I'm fine." The words came tight, as if she'd had to pull them through clenched teeth. She didn't look up from the bread. He poured her a mug of coffee, the steam curling in the cool air between them. She accepted it with both hands, holding it close for a moment before taking a sip. The way she breathed in, as though the warmth itself might stitch her together, caught his attention. He didn't ask any questions. Out here, a person had a right to their silences. The day settled into a rhythm that was both awkward and oddly steady. Elijah worked in the corral, hammering at a loose gatepost, while now and then he caught sight of her at the window. When he came back, she was sweeping the floor, her small motions interrupted by an occasional wince she tried to hide. He didn't stop her. Sometimes doing something, anything, was a way of reclaiming yourself, even when it hurt. By afternoon, a light wind rose from the south, carrying with it the faint scent of dust. He found her sitting on the porch steps, knees drawn in the hem of his shirt, brushing the boards. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "I can't stand feeling useless." He leaned against the porch post, folding his arms. "You're not." A faint, almost disbelieving smile touched her lips, though it vanished quickly. As the sun slid low, Elijah brought out a basin of warm water and clean cloth strips. He'd seen enough of the tightness in her movements to know she wasn't healing easily. She hesitated when he set the basin beside her chair. For a long moment, she seemed to debate whether to let him help. Then, with a quiet surrender, she nodded. Kneeling beside her, he loosened the bindings around her ribs. The purple shadows on her skin were a map of pain, some bruises fading to yellow, others still deep and fresh. "Didn't happen all at once," she murmured, her voice barely carrying. He didn't ask who had done it. A man didn't need a name to recognize cruelty. With steady hands, he rewrapped the cloth, binding it firm enough to hold her together, gentle enough not to cause more hurt. That night, she ate more than she had before, half a plate of beans and cornbread. She pushed the last bite toward him, and he took it without protest. After the dishes were cleared, she lingered at the table while he sat by the lamp mending a leather strap. The soft tick of the old clock filled the quiet. Sometime in the deep hours, he woke to the faint sound of movement. Rising, he found her standing by the open door, one hand resting against the frame. Lamplight caught the side of her face, pale, still unreadable. "You all right?" he asked. Her gaze didn't leave the dark yard. "Just needed to know the door isn't locked." "It never is," he said. For a long moment she stayed there, the night air brushing through her hair before she stepped back inside. By morning, the air had shifted warmer and carrying the smell of sun-baked earth. She moved through the small cabin with more certainty now, no longer pausing to study every shelf and corner. She swept the floor again this time, without wincing quite so much. Outside, Elijah fixed the last of the loose boards on the chicken coop, glancing toward the porch more often than he meant to. It wasn't mistrust, it was the quiet pull of wanting to be sure she was still there. The day ended as it began, without ceremony, without words they didn't yet have. But something in the way she carried herself said she had taken the first step toward staying. Trust didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, almost unnoticeable shifts, Like the way her humming lasted a beat longer before she caught herself, or how she no longer clutched the fabric of her shirt every time he walked into the room. Elijah noticed these things, though he never said so. One morning, he caught her by the window leaning on the sill to watch the corral. The bay mare stood quiet under the shade, ears flicking lazily. Bella, though he still didn't know that was her name, rested her hand on the glass as if measuring the distance between herself and the outside world. The knock of hooves on the far road drew his attention. A rider approached, hat tipped low against the sun. Elijah stepped outside before the horse reached the gate. Morning called Hank Mayers the neighbor whose spread lay 8 miles north. His eyes swept over the yard, lingering a second too long on the cabin door. Morning Elijah replied, his stance easy but fixed. "Just checking if you're needing anything from town," Hank said, though his tone held more curiosity than concern. "Got what I need." Hank's gaze flicked again toward the cabin, and Elijah's frame shifted subtly into the gap between them. It wasn't a threat, just a quiet barrier. Hank caught it because his eyes moved back to Elijah's face. "Fair enough," Hank said, tipping his hat before turning his horse down the trail. Inside, she was standing near the table when he came back. "You won't tell anyone?" Her voice was low but urgent. "Ain't mine to tell," he said simply. Something eased in her shoulders, though her gaze stayed on the floor. By week's end, she could lift a small bucket of water from the pump without flinching, though Elijah still carried the heavier loads. The bruises on her arms had started to fade, but there was still a shadow in her expression, the kind that comes from looking over your shoulder for too many miles. On the 7th evening, they stood on the porch together, the light falling soft over the hills. She watched the sky shift from gold to deep rose, her fingers brushing the railing as if testing its steadiness. "I'll go with you next time you ride into town," she said. He turned to her, brow lifting slightly. "You sure?" Her eyes didn't leave the horizon. "Can't hide forever." Her voice was calm, but underneath it he could hear something taut, a thread of determination tied to a weight he couldn't yet see. Elijah didn't press her for reasons. He simply nodded the quiet agreement of a man who knew some choices had to be made in silence. The days that followed carried a subtle shift. She began folding his shirts after they dried on the line, and once without asking, she mended a tear in his work gloves. He found himself setting aside the softer apples from the barrel for her to eat, though he never mentioned it. On the morning they left for town, the air carried the faint scent of distant rain. She climbed into the wagon with the mended green dress smoothed over her knees, the tear at the hem stitched so neatly you could barely find the seam. In the basket at her feet lay the faded shirt he'd given her days ago, folded as if it were worth keeping. They rode in companionable silence, the wheels groaning in the deep ruts. Every so often Elijah caught her eyes flicking toward the edges of the trail, not for beauty, but for escape routes. By the time the town came into sight, the sun had burned through the thin morning haze. The streets were narrow, the boardwalks crowded with barrels and crates, and already people were moving with the kind of purpose that left no room for strangers. Elijah slowed the wagon near the general store. The air here smelled of flour dust and horse tack of leather, cured long and dry. Beside him, she straightened her back. She was coming into the open now, and both of them knew it. The wagon wheels crunched over the packed dirt as Elijah drew them to a stop outside the general store. A few heads turned from the boardwalk, their glances quick but not fleeting. Beside him, she kept her eyes forward, chin lowered just enough to shield her expression. Mrs. Carver, the store's plump, sharp-eyed owner, stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Morning, Elijah." She greeted, her voice warm but curious. Then her gaze shifted to the woman at his side and her tone softened. "You must be helping him keep the place in order." She managed a polite nod, but didn't speak. Inside the store smelled of dried herbs, coffee beans, and new leather. Light filtered in through the front windows, catching on jars of penny candy and folded stacks of calico. She moved between the shelves with quiet steps, her fingers brushing lightly over tins and bolts of cloth, without picking anything up, like she was afraid her touch might disturb the order of the place. At the counter, Elijah ordered coffee, salt, and flour. Mrs. Carver bustled about filling the order when the door opened behind them. Two women stepped in, their chatter cutting short the moment they saw her. They moved aside to let her pass, but their eyes stayed fixed on her, their voices lowering into sharp whispers. The words weren't loud enough to carry, but the tone was slicing judgmental, the kind that could reach under skin. Elijah felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. He took the sack of goods from Mrs. Carver, set down the coins, and with a tilt of his head toward the door, guided her out. The sunlight outside was warmer than before, spilling across the boardwalk in uneven patches. She didn't look back at the women, didn't give them the satisfaction. Her shoulders were squared, her steps steady. At the wagon, a lanky young man leaned against the hitching post, the blacksmith's apprentice. His ash-blonde hair stuck up in places, and his hands were black with soot. He nodded to Elijah, then let his gaze shift to her. "You all right, miss?" he asked. She gave the faintest smile. "I am now." Elijah climbed onto the driver's bench, the wood creaking under his weight. She settled beside him, placing the basket of goods on her lap. As the wagon rolled forward, she glanced once over her shoulder, not at the apprentice, but at the store, her eyes measuring it like a place she might one day have to reckon with again. The road home stretched wide before them, dust rising in the wheel's wake. For a while, the only sound was the steady clop of the horse's hooves and the faint jingle of the harness. "Thank you," she said suddenly. "For what? For not letting them press?" He didn't answer right away. The silence between them was filled with the hum of the open plain. "Not my way," he said finally. She nodded, looking out at the horizon. The corners of her mouth turned faintly like the start of a smile that hadn't been used in a long while. By the time the cabin came into view, the sun had begun its slow descent, gilding the grass in a warm glow. They carried the supplies inside, setting the sacks neatly in the pantry. The quiet between them now wasn't guarded. It was the easy kind that came from two people sharing the same space without needing to fill it with talk. Later, Elijah stepped out to split kindling near the shed. The rhythmic crack of the axe head striking wood echoed across the yard. Glancing up, he saw her in the side yard hanging laundry. The damp fabric lifted in the breeze, pressing for a moment against her shape before falling away. She was humming again, the melody too low to catch, but steady enough to carry. It was the first time he realized that the sound of her voice, light, careful, suited the quiet here, and that it might be the start of something neither of them had planned for. That evening, the sky burned with the last streaks of daylight fading from molten gold to deep violet over the hills. Inside the cabin, the oil lamp's glow turned the walls to warm amber. She stood by the window, her fingers resting lightly on the sill, looking out as if the horizon might give her answers. "I left because no one would believe me," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but steady. Elijah looked up from the bridle strap he'd been mending. She didn't turn toward him, her gaze fixed on the darkening yard. "Even when I couldn't breathe right, even when I couldn't lie on one side without pain, they didn't believe me." He didn't push for details. A man didn't need the whole of a story to stand beside the teller. She turned finally, her eyes meeting his for a moment that felt like the air before a summer storm, charged and fragile. It was the first time he saw something unguarded there, something that reminded him of how a skittish mare might lean just slightly into a hand it trusted. They stepped onto the porch together. The air had cooled, carrying the chirr of crickets from the tall grass. Overhead, the first stars flickered into sight. "Do you think it's possible," she asked, "to feel safe in a place that isn't yours?" He leaned against the post, eyes on the dark horizon. "Safe's not about the land under you. It's about who'll stand between you and trouble when it comes." She let that settle in the space between them. Her shoulders lowered just enough to notice. For the first time since he'd found her by the milepost, she didn't seem braced for the next blow. The next morning dawned heavy, the sun sharp even in its early rise. Elijah was out by the barn mending a hinge when the sound of hooves reached him. Steady, deliberate, the kind that belonged to a rider who knew exactly where he was headed. He straightened, setting the hammer aside, and turned toward the road. A lone figure approached, dust curling around the horse's legs. As he drew near, Elijah saw the broad shoulders, the dark coat despite the heat, the posture of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. His face held the kind of confidence that came from ownership, not of land, but of people. From the porch came the faint scrape of bare feet on wood. She had stepped out, her hand clutching the frame of the doorway. The rider stopped at the gate, his eyes locking onto her. A slow, cold curve formed on his lips. "Thought you'd gotten far enough to disappear, Bella." Her breath hitched at the name. Her fingers tightened in the fabric of her shirt, but she didn't move back. Elijah stepped forward, resting one hand casually on the gate. His voice was calm, but the space he occupied between them was deliberate. "You've come a long way to talk to someone who doesn't want to see you." "That's where you're wrong," the man said, leaning forward in the saddle. "She belongs to me." Bella's voice came then low but clear, carrying the weight of nights she'd spent holding her own pain. Belonging to you meant being bruised where no one could see, being told to keep quiet when I could barely breathe, wondering if I'd wake up the next morning. The man's smirk faltered. "You've got no proof," he said, like the absence of witnesses could erase what he'd done. Elijah's voice stayed even, but iron wove through it. "Proof's not the kind of thing I need. She's under my roof. She stays." The air between them stretched taut as a drawn wire. The man's gaze shifted from Elijah to Bella, and back again, calculating the ground he'd have to cross. Something in his eyes changed. Without another word, he tugged the reins and turned his horse. The sound of hooves striking dry earth carried until it was swallowed by distance. Bella stood on the porch, her chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm. Elijah approached slowly, leaving space for her to move if she wanted. She didn't. "He's not coming back today," he said. She searched his face, as if testing the truth of that before letting out a long, uneven breath. "I thought if I left, I could be invisible." "Not out here," he replied. "But you can be safe." The rest of that day carried a weight neither of them spoke about. Elijah stayed close to the cabin repairing the chicken coop, where he could keep one eye on the road. Every creak of the windmill, every distant snap of a fence post in the heat pulled his gaze back to the horizon. Inside, Bella moved through her chores with a deliberate calm, as if measured tasks could keep her thoughts from drifting back to the man at the gate. She'd traded the mended green dress for the faded shirt Elijah had given her days ago. Sleeves rolled high collar loose against her neck. By late afternoon, the light had mellowed into the warm gold of nearing dusk. When she stepped outside, she carried a small bundle of wildflowers, purple, yellow, and white, bound together with a strip of twine. Without a word, she placed them in a chipped mug on the porch railing. He joined her there, leaning on the post. The air was still, the horizon glowing faintly. "You didn't flinch," he said. She glanced at him, a faint, tired smile tugging at her mouth. "I've done enough hiding." They stood together in the lengthening shadows, the smell of sun-warmed earth rising around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote's cry lifted and fell thin and lonely. "If he comes back," she began. "He'll have to get past me again," Elijah finished. Her gaze lingered on his face for a long moment, as though she was reading the kind of man who could make a promise without flourish but with the weight of certainty. Then she nodded, the smallest motion but final in its way. The next days slid by in quiet watchfulness. There was no sign of the rider yet. The undercurrent of caution hummed beneath everything they did. Elijah kept to his work, mending sagging fence lines, tending the stock, and checking the troughs. One evening, returning from the far pasture, he spotted her kneeling by the porch steps. She was bent over a narrow strip of soil where the morning shade lingered longest. Her hands were busy pressing seeds into the earth, covering them with gentle pats. "What's that?" he asked when he reached her. She looked up, the shadow of a smile crossing her face. "Flowers." As if that explained everything. Over the next week, small shoots began to push through the soil, thin but determined. She tended them each morning when the air was still cool, brushing her fingers lightly over the leaves as if committing their growth to memory. Elijah sometimes found himself standing on the porch just to watch her in those moments, not the flowers her. The way her shoulders no longer curled inward, the way she seemed to stand straighter each day. They went to town twice more. The stares were still there, the whispers still rose behind their backs, but she met them differently now, with a steady gaze that made most people look away first. Mrs. Carver greeted her by name on their second visit, and even the blacksmith's apprentice tipped his hat without prying. It was on the ride back from their third trip that the words came. The wagon jolted over a rut, and Bella reached out instinctively, her hand catching Elijah's arm. When she let go, her fingers stayed close as if unsure they wanted to leave. "You've given me more than a roof," she said quietly. "You've given me a place to breathe." Elijah kept his eyes on the road, but his grip on the reins eased. "You've earned it yourself," he replied after a long pause. That night they sat on the porch long after the stars had taken the sky. The flowers in the mug between them had begun to wilt, but the ones in the soil by the steps were growing strong. The days began to run together in a rhythm that was almost comfortable. Morning chores bled into long afternoons of steady work broken only by the sound of the wind shifting through the tall grass. The flowers she'd planted were now knee-high small buds forming at their tips. Each time she crouched to tend them, Elijah saw the same patience in her hands that he'd seen when she mended a torn shirt or poured coffee without spilling a drop. Careful, deliberate, like she was building something meant to last. One heavy afternoon, clouds began to gather to the west, their edges sharp and dark against the sunlit plain. Elijah had been mending a section of fence at the far end of the pasture when the wind changed, carrying the faint electric scent of rain. By the time he reached the yard, the first drops were already pattering against the dust. "Storm's moving fast," he said as he jogged toward the barn. Bella was already on the porch rolling up the sleeves of his shirt. Without hesitation, she followed him into the downpour to help drive the chickens into the coop. The rain came in hard sheets, flattening the grass, drumming against the roof. They worked quickly, her hair coming loose from its knot and plastering against her cheeks. By the time the last animal was under shelter, they were both soaked through. On the porch, they caught their breath, water running in rivulets from their clothes. Bella laughed soft, surprised, as if she hadn't expected the sound to come from her at all. Elijah found himself smiling back, though neither of them spoke the reason. When the storm passed, the air was heavy with the scent of wet earth. They sat on the steps, steam rising faintly from their damp clothes. "You ever think about marrying again?" she asked, not timidly, but as someone testing the depth of still water. He didn't answer right away. "I've thought about what it means to keep someone," he said finally. "Not because you have to, because you want to." Her eyes lingered on him longer than usual, the moment stretching like a still pond between them. The next morning was clear, the sky washed clean by the storm. Elijah found her hanging laundry on the line, a fresh-washed shirt of his snapping in the breeze. He crossed the yard, stopping close enough for her to look up from the basket. "Stay," he said simply. "As my wife." She froze for only a moment, her gaze searching his face as though weighing the truth in the offer. Then she nodded. "I will." No fuss followed, no flurry of arrangements. A week later, they rode into town, just the two of them. Mrs. Carver stood as witness while the pastor read the vows from a worn Bible. Bella wore the green dress again, now mended so finely that the seam was invisible. At her waist was a small sprig of flowers from her porch garden. Elijah wore his best shirt, its sleeves stiff from careful ironing. When they returned, the sun was leaning toward the horizon, casting a warm light over the land. Bella stepped down from the wagon and stood still, taking in the cabin, the yard, the flowers blooming against the porch steps. Then she reached for his hand, not with hesitation, but with quiet claim. Inside, she placed her bouquet and the chipped mug on the table. Outside, the flowers she had planted weeks before nodded in the evening breeze. The cabin, Elijah realized, no longer belonged to him alone. That night, they sat together on the porch bench Elijah had built weeks before. The boards beneath their feet still held the day's warmth, and the air was sweet with the faint scent of her blooming flowers. Bella leaned into him, her head just below his shoulder, her breathing slow and even. Overhead, the stars came out one by one, pricking the dark sky until it shimmered. "Sometimes," she said softly, "you don't know you're home until someone tells you you can stay." Elijah didn't answer right away. He just looked out toward the west where the horizon faded into deep shadow. Somewhere out there, trouble could still ride down the road, but tonight the land felt different. It wasn't just his anymore, it was theirs. In the days that followed, the rhythm of life on the ranch seemed to deepen. Bella moved through the cabin with ease, now her touch on every part of it. Freshly laundered curtains, polished wood on the table jars in the pantry neatly arranged. She started baking bread every few days, the warm smell filling the cabin in the early afternoons. Elijah noticed the way she would hum without stopping when she worked, the tune becoming part of the house's sound, as natural as the creak of the floorboards or the crackle of the stove. One late morning, as Elijah was repairing a wagon wheel in the yard, Bella came out to him holding a tin plate covered with a cloth. She knelt beside him, uncovering warm biscuits. "You work better with something in you," she said with a small smile. He took one, breaking it in half and handing the rest back to her. "Only if you do the same." They ate there in the sunlight, not speaking much, but not needing to. Toward the end of the week, Elijah suggested they take the wagon to a small trading post beyond town. It was farther than they usually traveled, but the idea of showing her more of the country seemed right. The road there was rough in places, winding through open stretches of prairie dotted with cattle and low mesas. The autumn light turned everything a warm, burnished gold. Bella sat beside him, hair tucked neatly beneath a scarf, her eyes taking in every turn of the land. At the post there were fewer eyes on them than in town. Bella browsed through bolts of cloth and small tins of preserves, her movements relaxed, almost light. Elijah bartered for a sack of oats and a new bridle. When they left, the sun was just beginning to sink. The long shadows stretched ahead of the wagon, the road lined with grass swaying in the wind. "Feels different out here," Bella said after a while. "How so?" "Like we're far enough from the voices that think they know me." He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "They don't get a say anyway." The faint smile she gave him was warmer than any he'd seen before. By the time they reached the cabin, the sky was deepening into night. Bella stepped down from the wagon and went straight to her flowers, bending to touch the petals, as though checking they'd fared well in her absence. Elijah watched her there in the fading light, realizing that every mile they traveled together seemed to settle her more into this place and into him. Inside, she lit the lamp and set the table for supper, moving with a quiet confidence that made the cabin feel fuller than it ever had before. The following weeks unfolded in the steady rhythm of work weather and the quiet comfort of shared space. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, steam curling in the cool air, and ended with the two of them side by side under the open sky watching the day fade. Winter hinted at its approach in the sharper wind and the way the light slipped away earlier each evening. Elijah had begun stacking extra firewood along the north wall of the cabin, and Bella had taken to stitching heavier curtains for the windows. She worked in the lamplight after supper, her needle moving with a sure, steady hand. One evening, while she sat sewing, Elijah leaned back in his chair, studying her in the glow. The small lines of tension he'd first noticed around her mouth and eyes were softer now, replaced by something steadier. He thought of the night he'd found her by the milepost, dust-covered, bruised, clutching herself together, and how far she'd come since then. When her gaze lifted from her stitching, she caught him looking. "What is it?" He shook his head faintly. "Just wondering how I got lucky enough to have you here." Her eyes softened, but she didn't answer, only bent her head back over her work with the faintest smile tugging at her mouth. 2 days later, the air turned restless. By late afternoon, clouds massed low and dark in the west, the kind that promised either a storm or trouble of a different sort. Elijah worked near the barn, uneasy without knowing why. From the porch, Bella's voice carried light, almost hesitant. "Someone's coming." He turned to see a figure on horseback approaching along the road. For a moment his stomach tightened, but as the rider drew closer, Elijah recognized the lanky frame of the blacksmith's apprentice. The young man tipped his hat when he reached the yard. "Brought you the bridle you ordered. Thought I'd save you a trip." Elijah met him at the gate, taking the parcel with a nod. Bella stood in the doorway, her hands tucked in the folds of her skirt. The apprentice glanced her way, his voice awkward but earnest. "Hope you're settling in, ma'am." "I am," she said simply, then disappeared back inside. When Elijah stepped in, a moment later she was at the table arranging a fresh bouquet of her flowers in the chipped mug. He noticed her hands were steady. That night, as they ate by lamplight, she said, "I don't think I'll ever stop looking over my shoulder, but I'm starting to believe I don't have to." He set down his fork, meeting her eyes. "Not here, you don't." The wind rattled the window just then as if to test his words. But she didn't flinch, only kept looking at him as though she believed it. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Bella was already outside when Elijah woke, tending to her flowers, despite the frost on the grass. He stepped out onto the porch, pulling on his coat. "You're out early," he said. "They'll need covering soon," she replied, brushing her fingertips lightly over a blossom. "But they've made it this far. I think they're strong enough now." He didn't know if she meant the flowers or herself. The cold deepened as autumn slipped toward winter, but the little cabin seemed warmer than Elijah could ever remember. The stove's steady heat, the smell of bread baking, and the low hum of Bella's voice as she worked made the place feel lived in, not just occupied. One evening, after the chores were done, they sat at the table with mugs of coffee steam fogging the lamplight between them. Outside, the wind prowled around the cabin, whistling in the gaps of the shutters. "You ever think about what's ahead?" she asked suddenly, her fingers circling the rim of her mug. "Every day," he said, meeting her gaze. "But I try not to let it take more space than what's in front of me." She nodded as if filing that answer away. Then her eyes dropped to the chipped mug on the windowsill where her flowers faded now, from the first frost still stood. "I planted them so I'd have something to take care of. Turns out I've got more than I thought." Elijah reached across the table, resting his hand over hers. "So do I." They stayed like that for a long moment, the warmth between them holding steady against the chill beyond the walls. In the weeks that followed, no sign of the rider came. Still, Elijah kept a loaded rifle by the door and an ear tuned to the sound of hooves on the road. Trouble had a way of biding its time. One crisp morning, Bella was hanging laundry when a neighbor's wagon appeared over the rise. It was Hank Mayers again this time, with his wife beside him. They pulled up at the gate, offering greetings and a basket of late apples from their orchard. Bella accepted them with a gracious smile, thanking Mrs. Mayers as though she'd known her for years. There was no trace of the guarded posture Elijah had once seen in her whenever someone new approached. After they left, he watched her arrange the apples in a shallow bowl on the table. "You handled that well," he said. "I'm not hiding anymore," she replied simply. That night they sat on the porch bench as the first snow began to fall. The flakes melted on her dark hair, catching the lamplight in tiny sparks before disappearing. She leaned against him, her head fitting perfectly under his chin. Sometimes she murmured, "I still think about the road, about what's out there waiting." He tightened his arm around her. "Then you remember what I told you, if trouble comes, it has to get past me first." Her breath came out slow even. "I believe you." The snow kept falling quiet and steady, covering the yard, the flowers, the worn ruts of the road. The whole world seemed to pause under that white hush. Elijah knew winter would bring its own hardships, but as long as she was here choosing to stay each day, that was enough. And for the first time in years, he felt the land wasn't just something he worked. It was something they shared. Your thoughts will help us create meaningful stories. And if you want to hear more powerful healing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the bell icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And most importantly, share this video with people who need a little hope today. Thank you so much for your time. We hear you, we listen to you, and we are honored to tell these stories for you.